The moment my dad said it, the room went quiet in a way that didn't feel like quiet at all. It felt like pressure, like the air had been replaced with something heavier. I'd asked a simple question, the kind you ask between bites of roast chicken, the kind that doesn't require setting down your fork. I'd wired them $42,000 8 months ago. My down payment, the one I'd been saving for since I was 26, putting away a few hundred every paycheck from my job at the clinic, skipping trips, buying store-brand everything, declining invitations I actually wanted to accept, $42,000. And I'd sent it to my parents because my dad said he knew a good real estate lawyer in their area, because my mom said it would be easier to consolidate the funds from their account, because I trusted them the way you trust people who held your hand crossing the street when you were 4 years old. Did you transfer the money to the lawyer? I asked. The offer on the Brampton unit closes next week. My dad put down his fork. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the table, then he looked at my mom, and she looked at the window. "We used it for your brother," he said. I didn't say anything. I heard the words. I processed each one individually. Used it for your brother. His program in Vancouver, my dad continued. The tuition, the deposit on the apartment, the first few months of living expenses, you know how expensive it is out there. I did know. I'd heard about it at every family dinner for 2 years, how Vancouver was impossible, how my brother deserved a chance, how proud they were that he'd gotten into the program. I knew all of it. What I hadn't known was that my money was paying for it. I was going to wire it back before the closing, my dad said, like that explained something. Like that made the geometry of what he'd done different. I picked up my glass of water. I took a sip. I set it down. And then I said, "When?" "What?" "When were you going to wire it back?" He said something about needing a few more weeks. My mum started talking about how my brother's program was only 18 months, and then he'd be earning good money and he'd pay me back. Of course he'd pay me back. Family pays each other back. She said it the way people say things they haven't fully thought through. She said it the way people say things when they know, somewhere underneath the words, that the words aren't quite enough. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect that there's a point where you start yelling, where the table gets loud, where dishes get pushed. That didn't happen. I just sat there, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, at the table where I'd eaten 17 years of breakfasts, and I thought about $42,000. I thought about the Saturday mornings I'd worked overtime at the clinic when Dr. Yelena was short-staffed and I could have been sleeping. I thought about the vacation to Portugal I hadn't taken because I was saving. I thought about the TFSA I'd opened at 23 because I'd read an article about compound interest and decided to take it seriously, which most people my age weren't doing, and I felt at the time a small private pride about that. All of that, for a down payment I no longer had. "I need to go," I said. "You haven't finished eating," my mom said. "I know." I drove home on the 427 with the radio off. It was October, so it got dark early, and by the time I merged onto the QEW, the sky was already that particular shade of blue-black that makes everything look very far away. I kept both hands on the wheel. I didn't cry. I think I was still too surprised to cry. Still in the stage where your brain is running the numbers over and over because it can't quite accept the total. $42,000. I want to explain something about my family that took me a long time to understand myself, because I don't think it's as simple as them being bad people. My parents immigrated from the Philippines in the early 90s. They worked hard. My dad drove a delivery truck for 11 years before he got his dispatch supervisor certification. My mom cleaned houses until she got the job at the dental office, and she's been there ever since. They built something here from almost nothing, and I watched them do it, and I've always respected that. But somewhere in the building of it, they made a decision about which of their children was self-sufficient and which one needed protecting. My brother was 4 years younger and, from what I understand now, probably needed more support in school than anyone recognized at the time. So my parents protected him, they intervened for him, they absorbed his problems, and they assumed, without ever saying it out loud, that I would be fine, that I was always fine, that being fine was simply what I did. I was fine. I paid my own way through college working at the dental office where my mom used to answer phones, which is how I got interested in the field in the first place. I got my dental hygiene diploma. I found a position at the clinic in Mississauga. I built my savings slowly and carefully and without asking anyone for anything, because asking felt like admitting I wasn't fine, and I'd been told by the way my family operated that not being fine was not available to me. The $42,000 was the first time I'd ever asked them for anything. Not for money. I wasn't asking them for money. I was asking them to hold mine. I got home that night and I sat on my couch for a long time without turning on the lights. I thought about calling my best friend. She's been my person since high school. The kind of friend who answers at midnight and doesn't make you feel like you're too much. But I couldn't figure out how to start the conversation. How do you explain something like that? How do you find the words for the specific feeling of realizing that your family had a hierarchy and you were at the bottom of it and they never thought to mention it? I opened my banking app instead. I went through my transaction history. I found the wire transfer. I stared at it for a while. Then I pulled out the email chain I'd had with my dad when we'd set it up, the one where he'd explained about the lawyer, about how it was easier this way, about how he'd keep it safe. I read it twice. Then I did something I'd been meaning to do for years but had never quite gotten around to. I went back through every financial interaction I'd had with my family over the past decade. This part took most of the night. There was the $3,200 I'd lent my brother when he'd had the car accident and couldn't cover his deductible. He promised to pay me back and hadn't, but I'd written it off because it felt petty to keep track. There was the $800 for the family trip to Niagara Falls that I paid for because I was the only one who'd had the room on my card at the time, also never repaid. There was the $1,500 I'd put toward my parents' new furnace 2 winters ago, which my mom had called borrowing and my dad had called helping out, and I had called nothing because I hadn't wanted to make it a thing. I made a spreadsheet. I'd been a person who didn't like spreadsheets, who found them cold and transactional, who believed that family operated on a different accounting system than regular life. That night, I made a very thorough spreadsheet. When I added everything up, the number was just under $50,000 across 8 years, and not $1 of it had come back. I closed my laptop. I went to bed. I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling and thought about something my grandmother used to say when I was small. Something about the difference between giving with an open hand and giving with a closed fist. She meant it as wisdom about generosity. Looking at the ceiling that night, I thought she might have also been describing how easy it is to take from someone who keeps their hand open. The next morning, I called in to the real estate agent and let her know the offer wouldn't be moving forward. She was kind about it. She said the market would still be there. I said yes, of course. I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen and felt the particular weight of a plan you'd been building for years suddenly not existing anymore. My phone had a few messages from my mom. She'd sent 3 in a row around 10 the night before, then 1 more in the morning. They said things like, "We should talk, and your father didn't mean it to come across that way, and your brother doesn't even know it would hurt him to find out." That last one sat with me. It would hurt him to find out. As if the person who should be protected in this situation was my brother. As if the geometry of the problem was still organized around him, even now. I didn't respond. About a week later, my brother called. He didn't know I'd found out. My parents hadn't told him. He was calling because he wanted to know if I'd be coming to visit him in Vancouver sometime, because he'd found a good dim sum place near his apartment and thought I'd like it. My brother and I have always gotten along. He can be oblivious in the way that people who've been protected their whole lives can be oblivious, but he isn't unkind. I've never blamed him for what our parents did. He didn't ask to be the one they chose. I told him I probably wouldn't be visiting for a while. He asked why. And I made a decision in that moment that I've thought about a lot since. I told him the truth. Not angrily, not as an accusation toward him. I just said, "Mom and Dad used my down payment to fund your move to Vancouver. I found out last week. I'm trying to figure out what to do with that information." There was a long silence on the line, longer than I expected. Then he said, "How much?" I told him. He didn't say anything for another few seconds. And then, and this is the part I didn't see coming, the part I've replayed probably 100 times since, He said, "I'm going to pay you back." I told him he didn't have to do that. I meant it. He said, "I know I don't have to, but I want to." He said he hadn't known. He said if he'd known, he never would have let it happen. He said a few other things that I won't repeat because they felt private. The kind of things you say to a sibling when you're realizing together that something went wrong in the family you both came from. We talked for almost 2 hours. By the end of it, I was sitting on the floor of my hallway with my back against the wall, which is not where I usually sit, but sometimes you end up somewhere unexpected. My brother and I made a plan. He would start paying me back in installments. He'd just started working part-time at a tech company while finishing his program, and he said he could put $400 a month toward it. I told him to make it $200 and put the rest into his own savings because I didn't want to recreate the same dynamic in a different direction. He laughed a little at that. It was the first time either of us had laughed in the conversation. Then we talked about our parents, and that was harder. I had a conversation with my mom and dad about 3 weeks later. I'd spent those 3 weeks thinking carefully about what I wanted to say because I've learned that there's a difference between having a conversation and having an explosion, and I wanted the first one. I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon, which felt like the right time. Not a family dinner, not a holiday, just a regular Sunday. My dad was in the living room when I came in. My mom was in the kitchen. I sat at the kitchen table, and she sat across from me, and I asked my dad to come in too. I told them what I'd figured out over the past few weeks, the full number, the full history. I said it plainly, without drama, the way you read from a document. I watched their faces as I said it. My mom's expression went through several things very quickly. My dad looked at the table. When I finished, I said, "I'm not going to ask you to pay me back all at once. I know that's not possible. But I want you to understand what happened, and I want us to agree that it won't happen again." My mom started to say something about intentions, about how they'd always meant to return it, about how they thought I was stable enough to absorb it. I said, "I know you thought that. That's part of what I need you to understand. I'm not a buffer. I'm not a backstop. I'm your daughter, and I work hard for what I have, and what I have isn't limitless just because I don't complain about it." The kitchen was very quiet after that. My dad looked up from the table. He looked older, I thought, in the particular way people look older when something has been said that can't be unsaid. He said quietly that he was sorry, that he hadn't thought of it the way I was putting it, that he knew that probably wasn't enough. It wasn't enough, but it was real, and I could tell it was real, and that mattered to me. My mom cried a little. I didn't. I'd already done most of my crying in the car on the way there, which was good timing on my part, I think. I drove home with the radio on low. It was late afternoon, one of those November days where the light goes thin and golden right before it disappears. I thought about the apartment in Brompton that I hadn't bought. I thought about the spreadsheet. I thought about my brother on the phone saying, "I'm going to pay you back," and meaning it. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think sometimes people tell these stories and they end with some version of, and then I won. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd named something that had been true for a long time, and naming it had changed the shape of it even if it hadn't fixed it. My savings are still there. I had to start over on the down payment, which is a brutal thing to do in a market like this one, but I've started over before. I know how to put away $250 a paycheck and not think about it. I know how to find the store brand version of things. I know how to want something across a long horizon. What I'm learning now, and I'm still learning it, I won't pretend I've arrived somewhere final, is that being the one who manages is not the same as being the one who can absorb everything. Being capable is not an invitation. And the people who love you can still fail to see you properly, and that isn't simple, and it doesn't resolve cleanly, and you can hold all of it at once. The love and the failure and the work of figuring out what comes next. I'm putting it toward a condo in Hamilton now. My friend came with me to look at 2 units last month, and we got coffee after, and she asked me how I was feeling about everything, and I said, lighter. Not fixed, not done, but lighter. That's where I am. That's the whole of it, as honestly as I can tell it. There's a version of this story where I stay angry. I think I'm allowed to say that. The anger was real and it made sense, and I don't think I have to apologize for it. But what surprised me, sitting on my couch in the dark that first night, was that underneath the anger there was something quieter. Something that had been there for a long time before the $42,000. A tiredness, maybe? The kind that builds up slowly when you've spent years being the one who manages, who adjusts, who absorbs. And you've been so good at it that the people around you stopped checking whether it was costing you anything. I thought a lot about what made this situation possible in the first place. Not just my parents' decision, but mine. The choice to wire that money without a contract, without a paper trail beyond an email chain, without asking the kinds of questions that would have felt, at the time, like distrust. I told myself it was because I trusted them. And I did. But I also think I was afraid of what it would mean to protect myself too openly. Afraid it would signal that I thought of us as separate, as people who needed legal structures between them. I confused vulnerability with openness, and I let that confusion cost me. What I understand now is that looking out for yourself isn't a betrayal of the people you love. It's just honest. It's knowing your own limits and naming them before they get crossed, not after. My grandmother's expression about the open hand, I keep coming back to it. I think what I've been missing is that keeping your hand open doesn't mean removing all judgment about where your generosity goes. You can be warm and careful at the same time. Those two things aren't opposites. My brother surprised me. That's the part I didn't see coming, and I think it matters. He didn't know. He was living his life in Vancouver, going to class, finding dim sum spots, thinking our parents had managed it all on their own. When I told him the truth, he didn't deflect or minimize. He sat with it. He asked how much. He said he'd pay me back. And then he did something I still find remarkable. He got angry on my behalf, not performatively, just genuinely, quietly angry that it had happened, that someone who'd been working that hard for that long had been treated like a buffer instead of a person. There's something about being seen by the person you least expected that rearranges things. It didn't fix the situation, but it made me feel less alone in it, which is its own kind of repair. I'm not where I wanted to be financially, and I'm not going to pretend that's easy. Starting over on a down payment in this market, at 31, when you already did it once, that requires something. A specific kind of determination that doesn't announce itself, that just gets up and opens a spreadsheet and starts again. I have that. I've always had it. I think what I'm learning now is to also have the other thing. The clarity to name what I'm owed. The self-respect to say it plainly. And the patience to trust that doing things right, even slowly, still gets you somewhere worth going. I don't think life rewards good behavior neatly or on a schedule. But I do think the choices we make about how we treat people and how we allow ourselves to be treated compound over time, the way savings do, quietly, incrementally, until one day you look up and realize you're standing somewhere different than where you started. Hamilton, a new unit, a fresh offer closing in the spring. That's enough.